Yeah, thank you so much. So, briefly, I would invite all my six chairpersons for this informative session that we are talking today of vaginal infections and torch infections on a webinar on safe pregnancy. So, I take this opportunity to invite Dr. Sharda Jain, who is the DGF founder, and DGF has already spread its wings throughout Delhi, and we have already 7 branches. DGF Outer Delhi is one branch whose president is Dr. Kishore Rajurkar, who is the chairperson today. Dr. Sharda Jain could not somehow join us. Dr. Kishore is HOD OBS minimal invasive surgery at a very busy Sanjay Gandhi Hospital, and we were already before introduction we were listening to how he has been fighting with the corona cases at Sanjay Gandhi. He is honorary finance secretary IEMA and Foxy, a chairperson of PCPNDT Delhi, and he has published many papers. Next, I would introduce Dr. Ragini Agarwal, because Dr. Ragini is a force behind the whole Haryana gynecologist. So she is the founder, president of this Haryana Association of Obs and Gynae, which is doing wonders, and the whole brainchild has been Dr. Ragini. And not to mention, she is also the vice president Foxy, and you can all see how Foxy is, the way Foxy is spreading its educational wings all over over India actually, and pan India. Dr. Ragini is the vice president, and I would later on, after I have introduced Dr. Mandakini, I would then request ma'am to say a few words to us on her Obgyn. I would also invite now Dr. Saroj Mudgil, the teachers of teacher. She was ex-professor and head ex-GT Medical College and a Himalayan Institute Jolly Grant Medical College. And she was a known teacher in PGIMS Rohtak, and I have the opportunity to be her student. Next, we come on to a very dynamic lady, Dr. Mandakini Meg. She is the chairperson ICOG, and ICOG under her chairmanship and with the dynamic secretary, Dr. Parag, is doing leaps and bounds, is progressing leaps and bounds. So maybe I now give this opportunity to Dr. Ragini to say a few words and introduce Dr. Parag as well and speak about her Obgyn. Dr. Ragini ma'am, please.
Thank you, Jyoti. Yeah, thank you for your kind words. The only message I can give, I have a wonderful secretary who is Jyoti Malik. She is helping for everything in the her OBGYN, and this her OBGYN is we are more focused on the social wing of the in the society with our 3 programs: Abhilasha for the reduction of the maternal mortality in the state of Haryana, Mukti, prevention from the unsafe pregnancies and cancer prevention in the women, and the 3rd program which we are running very successfully is the Udan for the adolescent health. And Dr. Manju Puri is one of our advisor, and Madam Mudgil is our chief advisor. And one person, I want to say a few words about Parag, my very dear friend, who is the secretary of ICOG. And first time, because of him, ICOG is become a very accessible institution, and really it is proving its worth as an Indian College of OBGYN to each and every OBGYN of India. Thank you, Jyoti, and over to you.
Ma'am, can you please introduce Dr. Parag? He would like to say a few words.
Parag is a Secretary General of ICOG, and he is a very, very busy practitioner from Pune. He has his own practice, and one word only which we can say, he's the friend of each and every OBGYN of Foxy.
Dr. Parag would like to say something about ICOG, sir?
Yes. Thank you, Ragini, for those lovely words. I bring greetings from ICOG, the Indian College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. I'll just quickly give some piece of information. I know it may sound repetitive for those of us who are attending it, but it is my duty to promote the Indian college because I'm shouldered the responsibility to work for it. ICOG was founded in 1984 with an idea to promote education, training, and spread of knowledge in the field of OBGYN, and not only in our country, also abroad. And the basic aim was to raise standards of education in practice in our country. Apart from the routine activities of ICOGs, which are symposia, ICOG, Dr. C.L. Jhaveri Symposium, all of us have seen it, and Dr. Manju Puri was part of the symposium this year. There are 6 training programs which I would certainly like to highlight. These are the 6-month certification courses which are run very, very successfully by ICOG for a long time now. Reproductive medicine, ultrasound, endoscopy, fetal medicine, vaginal surgery, and critical care in medicine. And this time we've started online courses, which is a brainchild of Chairperson Dr. Mandakini Meg. We've already started online course on contraception, which is a 1-week course, and the exam is conducted online at the end of it, and the certification is done. Another course which will soon be launched is on violence against women and examination of sexual abuse victim, which is a subject dear to the chairperson. Third online course which we launched last week is on adolescent gynecology, and my friends Ragini and Manju will agree how important it is to have information about the adolescent health. And this time we have made an attempt to do an online course under the banner of ICOG, and I must mention name of Dr. Sampath Kumari, who initiated this. How can you join ICOG? You can join ICOG as a fellow. This is for the senior members. Do visit ICOG website. You know how to get the information about how to join ICOG as a fellow. So please do it as soon as possible and join in large numbers. Once again, thank you, Ragini. Thank you, Jyoti, for making ICOG academic partner in this venture. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Parag, because you are just always a call away, and that is the best thing. ICOG, it is so very approachable, and an institute which is so approachable will always imbibe so many people, and the way it is growing, we can all see it daily.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ourselves, we can witness it. Yeah. Thank you very much for giving us this ICOG grant of 1 point for this webinar. And now coming on to the talks, because then we have very, very important talk today about vaginal infection and then TOJ infection. And we have to clear all our doubts about TOJ infections today from Dr. Manju Puri ma'am. So before that, we will talk briefly about the vaginal infections. And here I invite my dear friend, Dr. Jyoti Budhi. So she would be talking on vaginal infections. And Dr. Jyoti, now you can please start sharing your screen.
Yeah, I'll do that. Well, thanks for the kind word. And I'm so glad today that I'm able to connect with all the chairpersons, the seniors here, and thanks for their time. And also, I would like to thank Dr. Jyoti Malik for inviting me and giving me this opportunity, and also Tablet India to make this possible. So today I'm going to talk about vaginal infections and its complication. So I love the statement by Hippocrates. He says, make a habit of 2 things, to help or at least do no harm. So we see vaginal infections are so common, some of the women don't even come to our gynecologist. They go to the counter, take some tablets, and they're done with it. But this usually causes a lot of harm to them, even not knowing whether it's a physiological or pathological. So giving antibiotics without knowing the cause is definitely doing harm to her. So let's see how best we can treat these ladies. I'm sure all friends agree here with me. In your routine practice, you see at least a woman with a white discharge, at least one woman in your routine practice. It's so common. It's said that 1 in every 3 women suffer from bacterial vaginosis, and 7.4 million women suffer from trichomoniasis every year. So it's always important to have a basic understanding about the vaginal ecoflora. So this may be a repetition for the seniors here and little interesting for the juniors. We all know the normal vaginal pH is between 3.5 to 4. It's an acidic pH. How is this happening? The ecosystem in the vagina is full rich with estrogen, glycogen stores and lactic acid. And very important, we need to know the microflora in the vagina. The normal commensal bacteria, what exists in the vagina, 90% is lactobacillus. And the other 10% is the ureaplasma, gardnerella, and yeast. So how is the pH maintained acidic? We all know that the vaginal lining, that is the lining is the superficial cornified epithelium. And this, in the presence of estrogen hormone, it produces a lot of glycogen. And the glycogen in the presence of lactobacillus, which is the normal commensal in the vagina, gives rise to lactic acid. And this lactic acid is the reason to maintain the vaginal pH between 3.5 to 4. And indirectly, this pH is required for the lactobacillus to exist there. So they work symbiotically. In a mechanism, the lactobacillus make the vaginal pH into 3.4 to 4 so that it can stay in the vagina. So what exactly happens is, if there is any condition which decreases the estrogen or any condition which harms the lactobacillus, which is the normal guard in the vagina which protects from the pathogens, then the vaginal flora get disformed and it leads to a lot of infection. So why are women more prone for this infections? That is because of the anatomy. We know that the urethra, the vaginal opening and the anal opening exist in the close proximity, and the transfer of the pathogens are very common. So, and also women has short urethra, and this infection can also leads ascend and also leads in an infection of the bladder. Of course, perineum is loaded with fecal matter and the transfer of infection becomes more common. So, the other predisposing factors for urogenital infection is antibiotics. Definitely antibiotics given excessively does a lot of harm. And postmenopausal status, where estrogen is reduced and the flora again get disformed. Now, about unhealthy vaginal hygiene, most of the women who comes to the clinic, they don't really know about the vaginal hygiene. We need to even explain them about the vaginal hygiene. Of course, infected sexual partner can become another source of infection. Then other conditions where pre-op we put a catheter, we have to be very careful before inserting the catheter. This can also lead to the infection. And contraceptive when we use, especially this copper T or Mirena device, if the thread is not cut properly, if it's hanging, this can be a source of infection also. And other conditions where especially like medical disorders like diabetes mellitus can predispose these conditions. Having said this, now I'll be just taking you through just 10 minutes, next 10 minutes about 3 different important vaginal infections. I'll start with bacterial vaginosis, then go to the candidiasis, then trichomoniasis. So it's very important to know the difference between vaginosis and vaginitis. So what exactly happens? We all know that the vaginal flora, the normal commensal, that is a guard, is the lactobacillus, which is almost 90% in the vagina. Say suppose a woman goes to the doctor for any other ailment like ear ailment or pneumonia or any other conditions, then the doctor prescribes her with antibiotics. This antibiotic, which is a treatment for other infections, also decreases this lactobacillus. It kills this lactobacillus, which is a normal commensal in the vagina. What happens when the lactobacillus is decreased? Then the other commensals like the gardnerella, which is an anaerobic, and ureaplasma or mycoplasma start multiplying. So in vaginosis, what exactly happens is the normal commensal, because of its absence, other bacteria take over. So here there is no inflammation. Hence, it is called as vaginosis. But then if it becomes more severe, it can lead to inflammation. Then we call it as vaginitis. This is the basic differentiation. Now, having said this, we need to know the symptoms. How do they present to us? Most of the time, they come with a thin whitish gray discharge, which is fishy in smell. And this usually some of them may not even have any symptoms also. Then it's also more so when after having vaginal intercourse. Sometimes they can be asymptomatic. Hitching is also one of the common complaints. Though bacterial vaginosis is not attributed to STIs, but then it is also related to the sexual activity. Hence, after knowing the history, we need to elicit other sexual history, like any high risk factors for STIs, like any new partners or more than one partner. It's very important to find out the root cause of the infection, or any previous sexually infection disease she had in a year. Of course, obstetric history is also very important, like pregnancy, any postpartum, or any abortions, or any contraceptive use. And then importantly, we need to know if there are any instrumentation in the uterine in the recent years, like any termination of pregnancy or a hysteroscopy where the endometrium is accessed. So we need to elicit this important history. Of course, other medications, any antibiotic or steroids or any other medical condition she is suffering needs to be elicited. Having said that, having known the history, now it's very important to diagnose. So what is that criteria which gives us the pathognomonic features of bacterial vaginosis? There's something called as Ansell's criteria, where 3 out of the 4 is present, then we call it as bacterial vaginosis. First is, once we know the history, definitely we do a speculum examination. In the speculum examination, we see a thin homogeneous grayish discharge which is adherent to the vagina. They're very adherent. And if we do a pH is more than 4.5. And of course, if this discharge is taken out and it's put in the microscope and a KOH is added, it gives rise to a fishy odor. And then if on a wet mount, if we see this discharge, vaginal discharge, we see a lot of bacteria which are adherent to the flora. So this gives us a clue. So these were called as clue cells, and the presence of clue cell is really a pathognomonic feature of bacterial vaginosis. And there is something also very important. This is called as a Nugent scoring, which is widely practiced and it's a reliable test. So here, if the score is low, then it's normal. And if there is a high score, it means the woman is suffering from bacterial vaginosis. So having understood, knowing the symptoms, knowing the diagnosing, and next is the treatment. How do we manage her? According to all guidelines, they say that although 30% of bacterial vaginosis may resolve by itself, treatment is important. So how do we treat? We give with the normal metronidazole or clindamycin. But then metronidazole is 500 mg 3 times a day for 7 days. Then also, even after treatment, 10 to 15% of them, there is recurrence. They come back again. So for them, again, we may need to give another course of antibiotics. Though this bacterial vaginosis is not a STI, partner screening is not required in this. Even Cochrane 2016 has also supported and told that for bacterial vaginosis, partner screening is not required. Next, having done with bacterial vaginosis, next we will go on to yeast vaginitis, that is candidiasis. So what happens in candidiasis? We know I was surprised to know there are 150 Candida species, and then albicans are most common. That is about 80 to 90% is caused by albicans, and glabrata is 15 to 5%. So once we know about where is the source, how does this woman get this infection? 35% of healthy women, they have this through the vaginal route itself, and then it can also happen through the anogenital route. Of course, though it's not an STI, 25% of women, the source can be through the husband also. What are those predisposing factors which aggravates these infections? We all know when there is compromised immunity, when the woman is using broad spectrum antibiotics, or there any infection or any immunosuppression, this candidiasis is very common. And also if women is suffering from any endocrine disorders like diabetes, thyroid, parathyroid, and others. This bacterial vaginosis most of the time is seen at the late luteal phase of the menstrual cycle, most of the time. And then other predisposing factors is like clothing. If she's using an occlusive tight clothing where there is very less circulation of the air. Pregnancy, of course, can also predispose to this infection. What are the symptoms? Symptoms is the most important symptom. What we see routinely is the hitching. She has really terrible time with hitching in the private part, and there can be redness or swelling of the vulva also. The most important finding, what do we see in the per speculum examination? We all know it's a cottage cheesy white discharge, which is odor free. It's usually not smelly. Once we have diagnosed candidiasis, now also the other methods are, when we take this swab for culture and when we put it in the wet mount, what do we see? We see this is a candida. So we see some pseudo hyphae and also blastospores in 70% of the cases. Culture is not really required. What about treatment? Once we know about the diagnosis, how do we treat this woman? Say suppose routinely when we do a pap smear or the smear, and then we see candidiasis in the smear, they say these women who are not asymptomatic, we don't have to treat them just because we saw the candidiasis in the culture. It's not required to treat. Then treatment is when they have symptoms. In uncomplicated cases, we can usually go with the regular azoles like clotrimazole, miconazole, or echinazole. Of course, probiotic, which my dear friend Jyoti will be talking later. I'll be just not talking much about probiotics now. Then the other fungal infections, which is non-albicans, it can be treated with ketoconazole 200 mg or itraconazole 100 mg. Even fluconazole acts good. Then what about oral or vaginal route? Most of the time we it's oral or vaginal. So let us see what the Cochrane Library has told. They say that there is no difference in the effectiveness in both the routes. The treatment is almost 80% cure is seen. But oral route, most of the patient prefer, but then it's easier in the vaginal route, and we can consider vaginal route as a first-line therapy. Then how do we follow up these patients? If the woman is not being cured for 2 months, if there is a recurrence again, she has to come back and get herself examined. And then here husband antifungal is not required because it's not an STI. After candidiasis, we'll next go to trichomoniasis. This trichomoniasis is a sexually transmitted disease. This occurs usually like other STIs, maybe there may not be any symptoms. But then when they have symptoms, usually after 4 to 20 days of exposure, they can come up with history like painful sexual intercourse, and there can be some kind of yellowish green discharge, and it has a characteristic malodorous smelling in them. Then the most pathognomonic feature when we do a speculum examination is a frothy discharge. This is the most important feature of trichomoniasis. And in some cases, there may be some abnormal spotting even after the sex. So all this history should be elicited. And this, since it is a STI, even men can have symptoms. They may have a whitish discharge from the penis, and they can come up with a difficult urination also. Sometimes they may not even exhibit any symptoms. So how do we diagnose? Per speculum, very important. Here we see a typical frothy yellowish green, bad fishy discharge. And then cervix shows a typical strawberry pattern of appearance. And then if we take the discharge and put it on the wet mount, we see in the microscopy these trichomonads. These are single-celled with flagella, they move, they have movements. So once having diagnosed, then how do we treat? The treatment is again simple, metronidazole 500 mg, 2 times a day for 7 days, or a single dose of tinidazole is good enough, 2 grams. But if she is pregnant in first trimester, again, in metronidazole is very controversial. We can substitute it with intravaginal clotrimazole gel. And then if she is not symptomatic in pregnancy, the evidence says that we can treat it after she delivers. Of course, since it is a STI, male sexual partner has to be treated. What are the risk factors for this infection? Then the next question is there any way we can prevent this instead of, even before treating, can we prevent this? There is something called as vaginal hygiene, which is very, very important for us to educate the women who actually don't have any idea. We all know that vagina is very delicate. The lining is very delicate. So most of them believe that excessive douching and having a bath with antiseptic liquids, all these are helping them, but then it's very harmful. And sometimes they use a lot of perfume, bubble baths, and some deodorants also. So we need to counsel her and tell her the importance of vaginal hygiene. And then even the washing the underwears with strong detergents can also be a predisposing risk factors. And then poor menstrual hygiene has to be explained to her about changing the pads frequently. This is also can lead to kind of infection. And then most importantly is having multiple sex partner or any new sex partner which has led to this infection. We need to educate her about the use of condoms. So this in a nutshell, I have put all the candidiasis, vaginosis, bacterial vagina and trichomonas. Only the important point I'll be eliciting. Candidiasis, when you put a speculum, we see this cheesy white discharge. And in bacterial vaginosis, the important pathognomonic feature is the offensive malodorous fishy discharge. And then trichomoniasis, especially she comes with a yellowish green frothy discharge. These are the important highlight points about different infection, which helps us to find out what the reason is. Now, having said about the different type of infection, now we'll go for complications. If this infection, if it's left untreated or unattended, there is a panorama of organs which it can affect. So it can start with a simple vaginal infection. If untreated, it can attack the cervix and cause cervicitis. And then it can ascend up and cause the problem in the endometrial lining. And also it can lead to endometritis. And then of course, sometimes it can cause a pelvic inflammatory disease where all the upper reproductive organs are affected. This can lead to infertility also, tubal infertility and idiopathic infertility. Of course, it doesn't end in the gynec problems. It can also be carried for the obstetric problems like female landing up in chorioamnionitis, a premature rupture of membrane, and a preterm birth. Cervicitis, since the cervix is near the vagina, this is the first organ to get infected, and there can be inflammation of the cervix. And then if it ascends in the endometrium, it can cause endometritis. Ideally, chlamydia, gonorrhea, and tuberculosis are the regular pathogens which causes the endometrial infection, but bacterial vaginosis also can cause endometritis. We need to know about this. And then if it's left untreated, it can go and cause oophorytis, salpingitis. So importantly about oophorytis, how do we diagnose this? Usually these ladies complain of pain during ovulation or even during the intercourse. So we may have a clue that even the ovary may be involved, and they may have a lower abdominal pain and a lower backache. So if left untreated, the upper reproductive organs of the female can be involved, and it can lead to pelvic inflammatory disease. So here she can have an aggravate symptoms like lower abdominal constant pain, vaginal discharge, and sometimes fever also, then bleeding after sex, irregular menstruation, all these panoramic symptoms she can have. And also long-term complications we should not forget. She may go for an infertility. If she becomes pregnant, there can be an ectopic pregnancy, and there can also be a chronic pelvic pain. About infertility, since I'm a fertility expert, I just want to get this pointed to notice. Some of the time when we do hysteroscopy and we see the ostia very thin, most of the time, even though the tubes are patent, maybe one of the reasons for this narrowing of tube can be a previous infection of so we need to bear in mind that we need to treat this women and also find out is there any unexplained infertility reason, so that we can also pinpoint and tell that somewhere the tube is involved here. It doesn't end here. Not only the tubes and PID, it also known to release so many pro-inflammatory cytokines, and then where elevated and interleukin 8 is there, and it can cause idiopathic infertility and also can cause recurrent implantation failures also, according to the studies. So having said about the gynec, let us see about the obstetric part. So we know that PROM, preterm labor, is associated with these infections. So what exactly happens is the placental membrane is infected, the chorion and the amnion, and then this leads to premature rupture of the membrane and preterm. So preterm birth, as all evidence says, bacterial infections has reported almost 80%, 40% of preterm birth, and especially 80% of them, the preterm occurs before 30 weeks. So this is, this is a simple treatment where when we don't find out, so much of big complications happen. So also preterm birth is associated with lot of microbe instability. All these are seen in all the studies. And then altered vaginal microbia are there for PROM. All the study has supported this. So Yeah. And then now is about, these are the last 2 slides of my presentation for today. So here we know that prevention is better than cure. So is there any way we can prevent all this infection? Yes, of course. We need to sit with the patient and then explain her the do's and don'ts of the vaginal hygiene, as already before I have elaborated. And then I myself had a case of infertile lady where I had done an IVF, and then unexpectedly she was followed somewhere, and at 30 weeks she landed up with preterm and she lost the child. This was the question which was in the mind. And then I digged into all the research and saw all the guidelines says that no routine screening of bacterial vaginosis in an asymptomatic pregnant woman. But then CDC says that if the woman is at high risk, as in my case, if there was a previous history of preterm, definitely in the antenatal visit, we can go ahead, do a screening and then accordingly treat her. And also they say in pregnancy, if there is, if symptomatic, we have to avoid metronidazole. We can go with clindamycin 300 mg BD orally for 7 days before 22 weeks. And then unfortunately, these women again have recurrence, and almost about 80% of the women, even after treatment, there is recurrent symptoms. Definitely we need to be vigilant and then treat her accordingly. So ladies and gentlemen, I end up my presentation saying that vaginitis is a very simple to treat. We need to know the appropriate cause for this, and we need to prevent this so that the huge panorama of complication can be prevented. Thank you so much. Thanks for the patient hearing. And now I hand over for Dr. Jyoti Malik for the further session.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Jyoti, for such a detailed deliberation on vaginitis and the vaginal infections. Can you please stop sharing your screen so that I can start sharing now?
Yeah, sure. I'll do that.
Thank you so much. And your question answers.
Yeah, thank you.
Dr. Kishore Rajorkar would be happy enough to take.
Yeah. And I'm thanking all the chairpersons for their time, and I'm very happy that you've given me this opportunity. Hope to connect with you again and again. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Oh. Can I take the questions now?
No, sir. We'll take at the end.
Okay.
We'll take once we finish with all the presentations.
Okay.
Then we'll take.
Fine.
So continuing from where Dr. Jyoti Budhi has left, I will carry on. And she has such nicely detailed what all complications of these urogenital tract infections occur. So right from cervicitis, vaginitis, cervicitis, endometritis, oophorytis, salpingitis, PIDs, infertilities, chorioamnionitis, and preterm births. And 25 to 30% of these preterm births are due to infection. Now, where do these microorganisms come? They can come from either the tubes in a retrograde fashion, or they can come through hematogenous spread via placenta, or it could be ascending the cervix and the vagina. Now, bacterial vaginosis early pregnancy is a very strong risk factor for preterm deliveries and spontaneous abortions. Now, group B streptococcus also is a leading cause of primary neonatal sepsis, pneumonia, and meningitis. And vertical transmission may occur when the GBS ascends from the vagina to the amniotic fluid. Now, it is also associated with a lot of complications, and thereby intrapartum parenteral antibiotic prophylaxis for these women with positive GBS at 35 to 37 weeks is recommended by the CDC. But in multiparous, because there is a rapidity of labor, we hardly get any time to treat, because by the time we give it, the delivery is already done. So the data is, the giving them in multiparous women is limited and ineffective. Now we get a lot of changes during pregnancy, and right from weight gain, the changes in blood sugar levels, the insulin resistance, inflammations, changes in the metabolic hormones. And this is something very peculiar, the changes in the microbiota. This was also which happens, and I never paid so much attention to that. We were paying attention to other things, but the pregnancy changes in the microbiome is something I recently again could get how important it is. So there is change in the oral microbiota, in the placental microbiomes, the gut microbiomes, and the vaginal microbiomes during pregnancy. In the placenta, there's the presence of aerobic and the anaerobic bacteria. And in gut, there is a rise of actinobacter and proteobacter, whereas the Faecalibacterium decreases. So this is something very important. In vaginal microbiota, the lactobacillus, which is a good bacillus, increases nature, thereby is helping the woman by increasing the lactobacillus, the microbes which are present during pregnancy. Now, these are helping, these are making the immunological system tolerogenic, so that there is a good receptor, and there is they prevent the rejection of the fetoplacental unit. Now, all these vaginal defenses are these that is the mechanical barrier, protective enzymes like lysozymes. There are other immune responses like complement system and IgA. So these are the symptoms, these are helping. These are the vaginal defenses which are helping against the infections. Now, all these are being influenced by the microbiomes. And lactobacillus has a very important role. How? Because it helps by the antimicrobial properties which regulate the urogenital microbiomes. And lactobacilli, they modulate the host immunity. They alter the microenvironment of the vagina, and they alter the production of lactic acid. And they dislodge the pathogenic biofilm that is there. Now, there is a significant decrease in the overall diversity and increased stability and by the lactobacilli. So what we have, we can use antibiotics, but again, the more antibiotic will be harmful. As Dr. Jyoti Budhi was telling, that these antibiotics, if we have given pregnant women an antibiotic for any other thing, they remove the good bacteria from the vagina, and thereby increase the chances of infection. So on one side we are giving antibiotic to remove the infection, to help the infection control. On the other side, we are harming by removing good bacteria. And there are certain studies which they say they further deteriorate the condition by, if we say we have given erythromycin prophylaxis. So it does increase the bacterial diversity, and this correlates with increased prevalence of chorioamnionitis and other infections. So we have this something new, which is good friendly bacteria, like which we call probiotics, and the sources are fermented food, yogurt, etc. Now, what they do, they increase the frequency of the interferon Ghani and the peripheral monocytes. And this is how they help. They help by doing so many things. They help by secreting the IgA. They enhance the barrier function. They increase the organic acid production, and they destroy the toxin receptors, and they help in producing of antimicrobials. So there are many ways how these probiotics are helping. Another thing is that there is something called hydrogen peroxide, and these lactobacilli, they can the lactobacilli, that the good ones are L. reuteri and L. rhamnosus, and these, what they do, they adhere to the epithelial cells and inhibit the pathogen binding and the translocation. Also, these probiotics help in the production of hydrogen peroxide, which helps in increasing the degradation of the lipids, is the TGF, and stimulate the IgA antibodies. So these, how they modulate the vaginal microflora to prevent the pregnancy complications. And this is one way, in fact, the probiotics helped to reduce the preterm birth by as much as 50% in this study that was shown. They have anti-inflammatory property, and that is control the mucosal and the systemic inflammation. In this study, there was a benefit of probiotics in cases of BOH and for prevention of post-IVF pregnancy complications. So probiotics definitely have a big role to play in our cases where the woman has a history of BOH, or it is, in fact, even before the IVF pregnancy conception, the IVF specialists do prefer giving these probiotics. So it also improves the implantation. Not only it decreases the post-IVF pregnancy complications, but it helps implantation and increases the pregnancy rates. Now, this was another study where they showed that there was a beneficial role of these in reducing the GBS count in the pregnant woman. This was another study where they had there was a favorable outcome. Now, they are quite safe in pregnancy, and they are given orally. The rationale is that these lactobacilli are being excreted. When given orally, they are excreted, and then they migrate from the anal region to the perineum and to the vagina, and they colonize, proliferate there, and restore the vaginal flora. So oral administration is a proven method for restoring this vaginal flora. Now, only very few lactobacilli produce hydrogen peroxide, and these Lactobacillus rhamnosus and Lactobacillus reuteri, these two produce hydrogen peroxide. Now, this is also very helpful here because it exhibits toxic effects against the pathogens, and it generates reactive oxygen molecules. Now, these superoxide and hydroxyl radicals kill the vaginal pathogens. So these are various studies that they have shown that absence of hydrogen peroxide produces a lactobacilli. Producing lactobacilli can contribute to PID. And also these cause a preterm labor in women with, if we have given hydrogen H2O2 producing lactobacilli, now the preterm labor is seen to be, the incidence is seen to be lower. And also post-IVF pregnancy losses are less when we have given the probiotics. So directly how they inhibit the pathogens by producing lactic acid, by producing bacteriocins, and by producing hydrogen peroxide. And indirectly, they are also preventing the adhesion of the pathogens to the vaginal mucosa by the biosurfactant and the collagen binding proteins. So this is how these probiotics are helping us. And that is how, with these probiotics in hand, the reproductive health can be managed in a much, much better way. So that was a very brief about the role of probiotics in vaginal infections. And definitely we can take up the questions later on. They have been now proven to have a role in preventing preterm births and also helpful in the IVF pregnancies. Thank you so much. And now I would stop sharing my screen, and I would now request our next speaker, Manju Puri ma'am, to start sharing her screen. And ma'am is going to talk about the torch infections. So torch infections, how we understand them, interpret them, and treat them. So this is Manju Puri ma'am would be now talking on torch infections. All up to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Jyoti. Yeah, I hope my screen is visible.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. So torch infections. Well, this is something which is a problem generating condition in itself. getting a test and then interpreting it. No, so I think that is what most of us must have gone through at one time or the other. So I'll be talking on the practical approach to the diagnosis and management of torch infections. Now we know that torch infections are special. They are special because they are usually asymptomatic in the mother, but they can cause a lot of damage to the newborn baby. So these infections are acquired in utero or during the birth process, by the fetus or the newborn, and can cause significant neonatal and fetal damage. And they also contribute, to the early and later childhood morbidity as well. So if a child or if a fetus acquires this infection in utero, then, sometimes the newborn baby may be asymptomatic, but subsequently may develop mental retardation and other things. So they have long-term and very serious implications as far as the fetus and the neonate and the childhood of babies are concerned. So the infected newborn infant may show abnormal growth. There could be growth problems, like there could be FGR. There could be developmental anomalies, maybe hydrocephaly, microcephaly, or there could be multiple clinical and lab abnormalities. Say, most of the time it could be an ultrasound abnormal finding which could trigger, getting a torch test done, or could also arouse suspicion of torch infection. The original concept of torch perinatal infections was to group generally 4, initially it was only 4 infections. It was toxoplasma, rubella, chlamydia, and herpes, because they had similar presentations, including rash and ocular findings. And subsequently, the O included the others because other organisms also cause similar presentations. So this is basically an acronym: T for Toxoplasma gondii, O for others, which includes syphilis, parvovirus, hepatitis B virus, HIV, and also varicella zoster. R is for rubella, C is for cytomegalovirus, and H is for herpes simplex. The main problem is when we do a torch test, and torch test would actually test for antibodies against Toxoplasma gondii, rubella, cytomegalovirus, and herpes simplex. So my focus today would be on these 4 problems. So I told you that here the main problem is that the mother is usually asymptomatic or would have a very mild symptomatology, but the baby would be born damaged. So that is why these diseases are a problem, and we are forever worried about these problems happening. Now let's look at the magnitude of the problem. In India, the seroprevalence would mean if we do antibody titer in normal population, say 8 to 34% would be positive for toxoplasmosis, 70 to 88% would be positive for rubella, 80 to 90% would be positive for CMV, and 7.5% would be positive for HSV. This is a study which was published. So meaning thereby a large number of our population is rubella immune and also CMV immune. They already had this infection, asymptomatic infection sometime in their life, and they are carrying protective antibodies. Now, torch is the most misused investigation, especially in reference to recurrent abortions. Now remember, recurrent abortions can never be because of torch organisms. Whenever infection is a cause of abortion, it can only lead on to a sporadic abortion. Recurrent abortions can never be because of torch. So never ever order a torch test for patients who've had recurrent abortion. It is not a part of their workup. And most societies do not recommend universal screening, but there are geographical variations. Now the problem arises when we get a torch test done, and that too at a wrong time. So then, we get an abnormal report, and then we keep, wondering as to how to settle whether the patient has actually got acute infection or she's not had acute infection. So as far as geographical variation is concerned, European countries, especially Austria and France, where, they have a protocol of doing torch testing every trimester. But in India, we do not have any recommendations for universal screening as yet. And targeted screening may be offered to high-risk groups, and the high-risk groups would be the ones, maybe those who are, working in daycare centers, come in contact with lots of small children. So they can can get infected by CMV, or else people who have cats as their pets are more predisposed to develop toxoplasmosis. So these are the groups where you can screen. But in India, because cats are not a very popular pet, so we do not have it's not a part of routine screening. Now, so if torch is not universally recommended, so when is it indicated? So what are the indications in pregnancy when we should actually be asking for a torch test? So what first and the foremost is history of fever with or without rash. So if any patient comes to us, we need to do this test. History of exposure or contact with an infected person who's got a confirmed illness with torch organism. Any patient with pharyngitis, myalgias, malaise, sweat, lethargy, lymphadenopathy, hepatosplenomegaly, a combination of all these. It is not only pharyngitis alone, myalgias alone, malaise alone. So it has to be a spectrum, a cluster of symptoms where one would suspect that the patient could be having, and she's pregnant. We would be worried because a non-pregnant patient, we would not get torch done for these symptoms, but in a pregnant patient, there is no harm in getting torch done because it will help us in diagnosing whether the patient has got acute infection or not. Any patient with genital ulcers, especially clusters of small vesicles, which are suggestive of HSV, herpes simplex viral infection. Any patient who's got unexplained fetal growth restriction, any patient who's got unexplained IUD, any patient who's got unexplained oligohydramnios or hydramnios. Here, in the last three conditions, it is mainly to, the pregnancy is already advanced. So it actually helps us in finding out the reason why the patient has got any of these, trying to explain these events. So not from management point of view, but from the point of view of actually explaining these events, we would get it done. There could be a large number of times it is an ultrasound which is a trigger. So ultrasound evidence of fetal infection is usually manifest in the form of ventriculomegaly, that is hydrocephaly, microcephaly, intracranial calcifications, any cardiac abnormality, hepatosplenomegaly in the fetus, intra-abdominal calcifications, hyperechoic bowel, and hydrops fetalis. So these are also triggers for torch testing because these are the patients who could be suffering from torch infection. Now, how do we diagnose torch infection? So the reason why we need to diagnose it, I have said that, maternal infection is asymptomatic and a lot of damage done to the fetus. So for the diagnosis, it is not easy because if the mother is not symptomatic, it is not very easy to actually diagnose maternal infection. So it is basically based on blood test for specific antibodies. I will tell you about the basics of how to interpret that. And it can also be, diagnosed in the mother based on smears from the lesions, especially if she's got herpes simplex infection. Then a swab there from the ulcer, base of the ulcer could actually, you can do a PCR DNA and kind of, look at the organism. Look for specific antigens, and rubella swabs can also be done, although that's not a common way. So usually we would test them based on the antibodies. Now, as far as the fetal infection is concerned, the detection of infection is again based on detecting the antigen or genome in the chorionic villus biopsy, in amniotic fluid, in the fetal blood. So you can detect with the help of PCR in any of these samples to find out whether there is fetal infection or not. And then, once the baby is born, you can detect specific IgM antibodies. You can detect it even in the fetal blood if you do a chordosynthesis. So detection of specific IgM antibodies. Now remember, IgG antibodies, presence of IgG antibodies in the fetal blood or blood of a newborn baby does not reflect a fetal infection because IgG antibodies cross the placenta. Whereas IgM antibodies, if detected in the fetal blood or in the newborn baby's blood, would actually mean that the baby is or the fetus is infected because these do not cross the placenta. Now, if we look at the basics of how to interpret the serological test, we would get three kinds of reports. One is we look for IgM antibodies, we look for IgG antibodies, and we look at the avidity test. Now, if we look at the antibody testing, IgM antibodies, they appear immediately after the infection. and they rise, and then they would normally decline or disappear within about 2 to 3 months. And they usually would disappear, but sometimes they might last for 1 to 2 years as well. So they are the first ones to come up. If we look at IgG antibodies, they appear within 1 to 2 weeks, little later than IgM antibodies. They rise for about 1 to 2 months, and then they fall a little, but persist throughout life. So that is what is IgG antibodies. Then if you look at the avidity testing is basically done on IgG antibodies, where we would want to know whether the IgG antibodies are new, are they recently acquired, or are they old? Are they old from some chronic infection? So here, this test is done by, we add antigen to the sera of the patient, and we try to look up what is the binding affinity of the antibodies to the antigen. If the binding affinity is good, then it means there is high avidity, and that means the antibodies are old. And in case the affinity is less, then it means that the antibodies are recently acquired. So this would help us in differentiating certain conditions where there is reactivation of the virus. I will clarify it a little later. A positive predictive value of high avidity is 100%. So if you have IgG antibodies in high titer and the avidity is high, it means it is chronic infection. You need not worry. So that means the patient is protected against that infection. But in case the IgG antibodies have low avidity, it could mean that the patient has got recent infection, and the negative predictive value is 95 to 99%. This is also not bad, but not as good. Positive predictive value is 100%. Now let's look at the serological results. You get a report. So you look at IgM titers, you look at IgG titers. If both are negative, so it means the patient has not had any exposure. It could be toxo, it could be CMV, it could be rubella. For herpes simplex virus, we do not look at antibodies, we don't look at IgGM and IgG. So there the diagnosis of acute infection is always made when the vesicles or the lesions are there. If there are no lesions, then IgM and IgG have little to do, right? But there have to be lesions, only then can you order for IgG and IgM in herpes simplex. But for CMV, toxoplasma and rubella, we do order this whenever we suspect or we have any clinical indicator or we have an ultrasonic indicator. So if both are negative, it means there is no exposure. Now, if say IgM is negative and IgG is positive and it has got high avidity, it means it is past infection. So these two conditions are clear. There could be a third condition where IgM is positive and IgG is either positive or negative. So if it is IgM positive and IgG negative, it could mean that there is a recent infection. The patient has had acute infection. But remember that IgM is got a very high false positive rate, which is 30%. So 1 in 3 would be false, right? There could be a condition, say, where IgM is positive and IgG also is positive. Say, again, a recent infection. But again, we need to do IgG avidity test. And in case the avidity is low and IgM is positive and IgG is also positive and we have low avidity, it would mean that there is recent infection. Now, when we interpret the serological test, I said there are a lot of confounders. So that is why we always get into some kind of confusion when we are actually interpreting the results. The first and the foremost is absence of any typical clinical features for clinical correlation. Now, if you have a symptomatology and you find a result which is positive, you can always say that this is the result is because the patient has got this problem. But here you have an asymptomatic patient and you have a whole, permutation combinations of the results coming up. Second is it is an indirect test. You are not actually growing or trying to detect the antigen. So it is an indirect test. Then lab to lab variations. There are huge variations which vary from lab to lab. What we do is we get a result abnormal or positive from one lab. We quickly ask for another value from another lab, which is just not to be done. Because how do we know, supposing that report comes negative? So it doesn't reassure us. It could be either positive, it could be negative. So that means we need to have a third test done. So the best is if you have an abnormal test, you must get IgG repeated after 2 to 4 weeks from the same lab. And if you have a rising titer, it rises by 2 to 4-fold, it would mean that the patient has got acute infection. So don't jump from lab to lab. So that is very, very important. And anytime you have an IgM positive report, then the blood test has to be repeated from a reference lab. We would send it to All India Institute of Medical Sciences, right? So it has to be a very standard lab from where you should get your IgM repeated. So that is very important to know. Then the high false positive rates of IgM. I said never ever depend upon IgM as far as your diagnosis of acute infection is concerned, because there's a lot of cross reactivity with rheumatoid factor, with anti-nuclear antibodies, and with non-specific in vitro binding. So 30% false positive. So it creates a whole lot of confusion. So your diagnosis would only depend upon a 2 to 4-fold rise in IgG antibodies. So IgG and IgM antibodies can rise both in primary infection and reactivation of latent infection. Now we have CMV. CMV is a very special virus where, you know, you would have, you can have primary infection, or you can have a, you know, once primary infection is there, the virus can stay in the body and then become reactivated. Is it right? So whenever there is reactivation, again, the IgG and IgM both can rise, right? So this can create confusion whether it's a primary infection or it is a non-primary infection. And IgM antibodies can sometimes persist even for 1 to 2 years. So it may be an old infection, right? But the IgM antibodies may be there. So these are the confounders. Now, diagnosing acute infection. So how do we diagnose acute infection? For Toxoplasma, CMV and Rubella, remember, it has to be seroconversion. Seroconversion means that the woman was initially negative for IgG, but she now becomes positive for IgG. So IgG is dependable. So this is what is seroconversion. The second is significant rise in IgG antibody titer. So we do the antibody titer, and the patient, we have antibody, IgG antibodies present. We repeat it after 2 to 4 weeks, and we find a 2 to 4-fold increase. So it means it is acute infection. For herpes simplex, it is presence of lesions. So we never ever diagnose herpes simplex infection based on IgG and IgM. Never ever do it. So it is always when the lesions are present that we will say it is the patient has got herpes simplex infection. Now, diagnosis of fetal infection. Now, maternal infection I made clear. How do we diagnose? And fetal infection. So one is ultrasonic markers. Ultrasonic markers are, quite consistent as far as diagnosis of fetal infection is concerned. Antigen detection, that is by PCR DNA from the amniotic fluid, from the fetal blood. Now, we have not included chorionic villus biopsy, villus biopsy in this. Now, if chorionic villus biopsy is positive for PCR DNA of the antigen detected, it only means placental infection. It may not get translated into fetal infection, right? So it is not that whenever placental infection is there, all the fetuses would be affected, right? So that is why amniotic fluid and fetal blood has been considered as antigen detection for PCR DNA, which would mean there is fetal infection. This is especially true for toxoplasmosis. Say the placental infection may occur in a large number of patients, but fetal infection would occur in much lesser number. Then detection of IgM antibodies in fetal blood is again diagnostic that this baby is suffered from, fetus is suffered from of infection. Then MCA Doppler flow studies and cord blood hematocrit are important for parvovirus. So it is not here, it is not in the purview of the discussion today. Now, what are the clinical features of newborn in relation to the causative organisms? So intracranial calcifications, think of CMV and Toxoplasma. If there is cataract, think of rubella and HSV. If there is chorioretinitis, think of Toxoplasma and CMV. If there are bone lesions, think of syphilis and rubella. Blue berry muffin lesions, rubella. Microcephaly, CMV. Hydrocephalus, Toxoplasma. And vesicles, think of HSV, varicella zoster virus, and syphilis. So this is, this is a chart which you should keep handy. Now, once we've talked about the basics and we know that, how to diagnose maternal infection and how to diagnose fetal infection, now let's go, condition-wise. How do we manage rubella infection during pregnancy? I'm talking about acute rubella infection during pregnancy. Now, if you look at this chart, it tells you that if you are able to diagnose acute rubella infection in the first trimester, and remember it has to be by seroconversion or by a 2 to 4-fold rise in IgG antibody titer within 2 to 4 weeks, or doing a IgG avidity testing, which is low. So these are the only ways of diagnosing acute infection. So the risk of infection to the fetus is 90% and the risk of congenital anomaly is 100%. So if you diagnose acute rubella infection in first trimester, please advise MTP. In second trimester, between 13 to 17 weeks, the risk of infection, fetal infection, is 60%, and the risk of congenital anomalies would be 50%. That means 30% chance. So you will tell the woman that there's a 30% chance that your fetus will be abnormal, and you can offer MTP, right? In the second trimester, between 18 and 20 weeks, the risk of infection is 25% to the fetus, but the risk of congenital anomaly is negligible. So usually there is some amount of deafness in the baby and no intervention is required, right? So between 18 and 20 weeks. And in third trimester, if you find acute rubella infection, no intervention is required. So we should be very clear about the management of rubella infection here. Now, management of acute toxoplasmosis during pregnancy. Now, look at this chart. It clearly says that as the pregnancy advances, the chances of fetal infection increase steeply. They increase from 5% at 13 weeks to 77% at 36 weeks. So the risk of fetal infection increases, but if you look at the other side here, the risk of damage or clinical consequences to the baby or the newborn decrease. They considerably decrease and the severity also decreases, right? So that means in a systematic review of congenital toxoplasmosis, the odds of developing clinical sequences decrease by 4% per additional week of gestation at seroconversion. So if your woman has got seroconverted today, then with every passing week, the risk of having the baby having clinical sequelae would reduce by 4%. So how do we counsel here? So you have a patient who is diagnosed in the first trimester. So in the first trimester, we said the chances of fetal infection are 10 to 15%, and severe damage would be there in 90 to 95% in case it is infected, right? So you can just counsel the patient that, you know, the chances of your fetus getting affected are only 10 to 15%. So that means 85 to 90% would be normal also. But it all depends upon whether your patient is a multiparous patient or is she a patient who has got, treated after, conceived after infertility. You could have a whole lot of scenarios. So if she does not want to continue with the pregnancy, do MTP. But in case she wants to continue with the pregnancy, then you involve a fetal medicine specialist, start her right away on spiramycin, and then do a ultrasound every month, and then do a amniocentesis at 18 weeks. Now, spiramycin will prevent, infection of the placenta. But spiramycin does not pass on to the fetus. It does not cross the blood-brain barrier. So that is why we need to confirm a fetal infection by doing amniocentesis at 18 weeks and then change the medication. But we definitely start spiramycin as soon as the acute infection is diagnosed. If no infection is diagnosed, then we continue at 18 weeks. If you do amniocentesis and there is no infection, then we continue spiramycin and do a monthly ultrasonography. But in case infection is detected, say PCR comes positive for toxoplasmosis, we counsel again regarding 6 to 10% chance of the baby being affected. Right? We said there's 90 to 95% chance of this 10 to 15% where baby could be damaged. So we can say that there's 6 to 10% chance that the baby would be affected. So we can offer MTP once again, because here we know that the baby is already infected. Here we did not know whether the fetus was infected. So if the MTP is declined, we switch over to sulfadiazine plus pyrimethamine plus folinic acid and do ultrasound every month till delivery. So here, because we know that there is fetal infection, and sulfadiazine and pyrimethamine have their own side effects also. They have teratogenic effects and they have side effects. So if at 18 weeks you find that the fetus is infected, that's the earliest we can diagnose. And we will put them on these drugs, which will prevent infection from damaging the fetus. Now, in the second trimester, the chances of fetal infection are 20 to 40%. There it was only, in the first previous slide, I said it was 10 to 15%. Here the chances of infection are more, but the severity, but severe damage is much less. It is only in half of these. It will be in 50% of these will have. Whereas in there, in the first trimester, it was 90%, 95% who would have damage. So we start the patient on spiramycin, advise ultrasound and amniocentesis for any evidence of fetal infection or damage. If no infection, continue only spiramycin and do ultrasound monthly. If fetal infection present, we may offer MTP if the patient is less than 20 weeks, right? Or else same, we put her on sulfadiazine, pyrimethamine, folinic acid and ultrasound every month till delivery. Now, what happens in case you diagnose acute infection in the third trimester? So here the chances of fetal infection are very high, 70 to 75%, but severe damage is almost negligible. Is it right? So the fetus may be infected, but there is no damage to the fetus done. So if the child is less than, if the pregnancy is less than 37 weeks, we start spiramycin, advise an ultrasound and do amniocentesis to find out whether the fetal actually is affected or not, right? And in case the patient reaches 37 weeks or she's more than 37 weeks, we deliver the baby. So now looking at the drug dosing. So spiramycin is actually a macrolide, just like azithromycin and erythromycin. So we give 1 gram 3 times a day orally. It prevents placental infection and not fetal infection. So remember, we can't continue the pregnancy only on spiramycin in case we have an infected fetus. So pyrimethamine and sulfadiazine is the combination which we use once fetal infection is established with the help of amniocentesis. So pyrimethamine is given in the dose of 25 milligram per day. Some people give it even as 50 milligram per day. And sulfadiazine is given as 4 grams per day in 2 to 3 divided doses. Because, pyrimethamine is a folate antagonist, so we need to add folinic acid. There is no point adding folic acid. You have to add folinic acid 10 to 20 milligram per day orally during the time when the patient is on pyrimethamine and sulfadiazine, and we give it till 1 week after pyrimethamine therapy is stopped. This has to be continued for 1 week more. So if a patient is on spiramycin, we don't need to monitor anything, but in case the patient is on pyrimethamine and sulfadiazine, we need to monitor CBC twice weekly and increase the dose of folinic acid if the counts, it causes bone marrow suppression, pyrimethamine. So in case the counts start declining, then we can increase the dose of folinic acid. So remember that once the fetus is in, once you have acute maternal infection, it is always good to have a fetal medicine specialist on board to help you. Looking at the CMV infection during pregnancy. Now in CMV infection, I said it is different. Now with rubella, if the patient gets infection once, she is rubella immune all through her life. She will never get rubella again. If a patient gets toxoplasma infection, right? So she's toxo-immune, except in case she is severely immunocompromised, wherein she can get a reactivation. So in all practical purposes, a patient who is IgG positive for toxo and IgG positive for rubella, so she is protected. So you should counsel her that she is lucky to have these antibodies present. So she is protected against rubella, she is protected against toxo. With CMV, the things are different. With CMV, I said the infection could be primary or it could be recurrent. Recurrent would mean a reactivation or it could be an infection with a new strain. But you need to remember that in case it is a primary infection, the risk of congenital CMV is 40%, but if it is secondary infection, the incidence is only less than 10%. And it is rare to have any kind of long-term effects with secondary infection. Whereas with primary infection, there could be delayed onset of CMV in 6%. It could be perinatal death in 0.4%. So it is very important to decide. So if a patient is CMV IgG positive, right? So we actually, and you establish an acute infection. Say you get an IgM positive, you get IgG positive, right? Or the patient has got any symptomatology or any trigger. And in the torch, you get, IgM positive, IgG positive, or when you do a repeat, there is a seroconversion, or there is a 2 to 4-fold rise in IgG. You need to do IgG avidity testing. If she's got IgG antibodies, you need to do IgG. It is not for all CMV patients and all pregnant patients. It is only when there is a trigger. So it could be a clinical trigger, it could be an ultrasonic trigger. but not as a routine. Don't do this test as a routine. We said about 80 to 85% of Indian women are already CMV immune. Is it right? So if there is anything which is triggering, then you do it. And then you have to do an IgG avidity testing. If it is low, then it means primary infection. If it is high, it means it is recurrent infection. So that means the prognosis for recurrent infection would be much better vis-a-vis what it would be for primary infection. So how do you take decisions here? CMV, toxo, you have treatment. CMV, you do not have any treatment. So if your patient is already crossed 20 weeks of gestation, there is no point testing her for anything. It is not going to help you in your management. In toxo, it will help you because you have drugs available. Here, you do not have any drugs available. So if the gestation is less than 20 weeks and you've been able to diagnose, please terminate the pregnancy. If it is more than, I'm talking about primary infection, where the chances are 40% that the fetus would be infected. If it is more than, you will offer termination, explaining her the prognosis. She might take a decision whichever way the patient wants. If it is more than 20 weeks and you do a prenatal diagnosis, you can confirm it by amniocentesis, right? But remember that CMV will come positive after acute maternal infection only after 6 to 8 weeks. So if you diagnose infection at 16 weeks, there is no point doing amniocentesis at 18 weeks. You will not get a good result. You will not get, the result may be negative. So you have to wait for 6 to 8 weeks for the fetus to excrete CMV in the urine, and then you can capture it. So basically CMV is a difficult scenario. So it is much better not to unnecessarily do these investigations. You can do this investigation only to establish the cause for the damage to the baby. Say, I told you, if it is IUD unexplained, if it is FGR unexplained, if it is, malformations unexplained, then maybe you can kind of look up, but not otherwise. And in case it is a recurrent infection, termination is not considered. You counsel the couple saying that the risk of transmission is only 0.5 to 1.5%. And you would know it is recurrent when the IgG antibodies are present and the avidity is high. It means the patient has got an old infection. So symptomatic neonatal disease here would be less than 1%. That is only in the form of hearing loss. So you have to explain this to the patient and let the patient take a decision. And then you do ultrasound every month, and you do a prenatal testing diagnosis only if abnormal ultrasound findings are there. I'll just take you through 1 or 2 case scenarios. So this is a primary gravida who was treated case of infertility, presence at 10 weeks. Someone is ordered for a torch testing. A CMV IgG is positive and IgM is positive. So as we had discussed regarding the basis of interpretation, so it could either be a primary infection, that means, primary infection during the period since conception. So within the first 1 or 2 months, where in case it is primary infection, then the risk of fetal infection is 40 to 50%. The second is it could be reactivation of latent CMV. I said that CMV can get reactivated, where the fetal infection is 0.5 to 1%. It could also be past infection. Say IgG is positive and IgM is false positive. So it could be any of these 3 conditions. So what do we do? What next? So we look at, are the IgG antibodies recent or old? So that means we do a avidity testing. And second is there any rising titer of IgG antibodies? So we repeat the IgG. She's just 10 weeks, no? So after 2 weeks, we repeat IgG. So let's find out if the IgG titers are 2 to 4-fold raised or not. If they are raised, that means it is acute infection and it is primary infection. So that means we need to offer termination of pregnancy to this patient. So what we do, we repeat IgG testing after 2 to 4 weeks. We do IgG avidity test. So if repeat IgG test shows no rise or a small rise and IgG avidity is high, it means it is old infection. We reassure the patient that nothing to worry, everything is fine. If repeat IgG test shows a 2 to 4-fold rise, it means it is recent infection. Okay, but it could be either primary or reactivation. So we do a IgG avidity testing. So if the avidity testing is high, it is reactivation. So where we can again reassure the patient. Whereas if it is low, that means it is primary infection. That is, she's had it in a recent, say, 3 to 4 months. So we counsel the patient accordingly. Another case where 31 years old woman who is gravida 4, para 0, abortion 3, she presents with 23 weeks of pregnancy. She is advised torch panel by a treating obstetrician. And this is the report. IgG toxo positive, rubella positive, CMV and IgM equivocal, CMV positive, and IgM negative. Now, quite often I've seen patients, getting treated for getting toxo antibodies negative. They keep getting spiramycin on and on and on because people are trying to, get rid of these bodies. Remember, these will be present all through life. So you can never get rid of them. Now, what is the interpretation of this? She is toxoimmune. So we say it is good that she is IgG negative. Now, rubella IgG positive, IgM equivocal. So either she may have suffered acute infection in the past 2 to 3 months, which is a serious condition because she is 23 weeks, right? So she might have had infection before 17 weeks of gestation, or she is rubella immune with false positive IgM. So it could be either of the two, right? Then CMV is positive, that means she is CMV immune. All right. So now what next? So what are the issues here? Was the torch panel indicated in this woman at 23 weeks? The answer is no, because you can't do anything after 23 weeks and there is no trigger, and recurrent abortion is not a cause for doing torch. Second is the time appropriate? The answer is absolutely no, because she's 23 weeks. You can't even offer a termination of pregnancy. Now, what has happened now? You need to settle this issue of rubella. She's IgG positive and IgM equivocal. So now you start testing. But if she would want you to tell her that, because you have to, kind of prognosticate for her, but she's 23 weeks. Even if she's acute rubella infection, you can't do anything about it. But there is a worry with the patient because the report has come, abnormal. So you will have to settle this. So here then you do a IgG avidity testing and you repeat rubella antibodies after 2 to 4 weeks. So after all that 4 months of the patient and your own self have got into, distress because of a wrong decision of doing a torch test. Now, remember, infection with various organisms and immunity conferred. So toxoplasma immunity to toxoplasma remains lifelong, except in immunocompromised individuals. Rubella infection stays lifelong. However, immunity consequent to vaccination tends to wean off. That is why we say any patient who comes for preconceptional counseling or for treatment of infertility, please do rubella IgG antibodies and give her a booster in case her antibody titer is not adequate, if she is IgG negative. In CMV, organism remain dormant after primary infection and is known for reactivation. So that is why this is a little more tricky, but you do not have any treatment for this. HSV, virus remains dormant after initial infective episode. Asymptomatic shedding and recurrences are known to occur. And immunity against one type of HSV, 1 or 2, can confer protection against other type. Now remember, in HSV, there is another issue. There are 2 types of HSV, HSV1 and HSV2, although we are more concerned about HSV2. Just 2 slides about the management of HSV. So there are 3 types of infections in HSV, because you have 2 types of HSV, so 3 types. One is primary infection. So primary infection would mean the lesions, the infection is always diagnosed when lesions are there. You never diagnose it on the basis of this. So you will do these only if, the lesions are, if at all you will do it. Otherwise, there is no point doing it. So if the lesion is present, you find out by doing you must first do a culture or PCR reaction from the lesion base. First find out, is this lesion because of HSV1 or HSV2? Only then you need to do this antibody testing. Otherwise, it does not kind of take you anywhere. So you look at the HSV, antibody screening, you do IgG. There is no point doing IgM for HSV. There is absolutely no point doing IgM. You only do IgG HSV1 and IgG HSV2. So if the lesions are there and both these antibodies are absent, so that means it is a primary infection. And the patient is not protected against any type of HSV infection. And the risk of transmission is 40 to 44%. Second could be non-primary first episode. That means a patient has got lesions now. She was infected with one type of HSV in the past. The IgG antibodies for that are positive, right? But with the type with which she's got infected this time is not the same. So this is a fresh infection. Say she's got antibodies against HSV1 and now she gets infected with HSV2, right? So the risk is lower than what it would be with the primary when both antibodies are absent. So infection with even one type will confer some amount of protection. In recurrent, recurrent would mean she's, you find out that it is HSV2 which is causing the infection, and her antibodies to HSV2 are also present. So it could be with HSV1 also. The risk of infection is much, much lower. So it is very important to decide whether it is a primary infection, non-primary. With primary and non-primary is almost the same. So, it doesn't matter much, but recurrent you would know. So recurrent you can know from history also, that whether she's had that in the past. You need not do these antibody testing. So doing antibody testing for HSV actually is not desirable. Now for the diagnosis, I think I've already said. Now what is the treatment? Treatment depends on classification, severity and timing. Or the primary or non-primary first episode. So if the patient says that she is got, for the first time, she's got this infection, you start with acyclovir 400 milligram thrice a day for 7 to 10 days. And, the lesions should get cured, but you need to restart antivirals from 36 weeks because we said they are asymptomatic, they shed asymptomatically also. So you restart antivirals from 36 weeks till the onset of labor, right? And for recurrent episodes, they are usually short-lived. So you may or may not start on acyclovir, but you need to start suppressive therapy from 36 weeks. So any patient who gets any episode during pregnancy, so normally we would start her on acyclovir thrice a day and also restart her from 36 weeks onwards for suppressive therapy, because the mode of delivery is decided based on whether the lesions are there or not. If the lesions are there, we do a cesarean. If the lesions are not there, then we do a vaginal delivery. So cesarean section at onset of labor or rupture of membranes if lesions are present, or prodromal symptoms are, remember it is not only lesions. That herpes would start with burning and pain. So in the vulval area. So it could be any of these. So if we feel she's got acute infection or she's got active lesions, so we need to do a cesarean. In those with no lesions or prodromal symptoms, the decision depends on the type and timing of infection. Now, RCOG recommends cesarean section for the first episode of infection in last trimester. So if the patient gets a first episode in the last trimester, they say within 6 weeks of the expected date of delivery, do a cesarean. Others say that in case she has a first episode, you don't stop the medication, you continue on acyclovir, and then you can offer her a vaginal delivery. So there is, this is debatable. So women with recurrent episode and no lesions or prodromal symptoms, a cesarean section is not warranted. So that is why we would keep the patients on, with recurrent episodes, we keep them on suppressive therapy from 36 weeks onwards. So to conclude, torch infections can cause significant morbidity and mortality in the fetus, and they are asymptomatic in the mother. As most maternal infections are asymptomatic, high index of suspicion should be maintained. Universal screening is not advocated except for HIV and syphilis. Pregnant women may be offered a baseline immune status assessment, either in the non-pregnant state or in early pregnancy. Please don't do it nearer to 20 weeks or later than 20 weeks. You must have a month available for you to decide whether the patient has actually got acute infection or not. Primary prevention in the form of vaccination, post-exposure immunoglobulins, and education regarding preventive measures. Like anyone who's got a cat as a pet, she should be asked to take precautions, is very, very important. And serological tests should be interpreted carefully for accurate diagnosis and timely initiation of management or no management. Thank you so much for patient hearing. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, ma'am. That was fantabulous. That was fantabulous. I mean, we could really sort of make again how we have managed these torch infections. And we have many, many questions here. Now, Dr. Kishore,
Dr.
are you
Manju,
there?
she has presented
Yes.
fantastic.
Yes, sir.
absolutely
Your comments,
fantastic.
and then you
So
start with
I
the
have some
questions,
questions. First, I'll take
and answering as
for
well, and
vaginal
asking Dr.
infections.
Manju Puri.
There was a
You must
question.
be having the questions on your screen, sir.
I have what do you do for the recurrent vaginitis infections in adolescent patients? Any of you can take, and Dr. Jyoti, both Jyotis are there to open. for the answer.
Sir, Jyoti has left. Actually,
Okay,
she had.
okay. So
Yeah.
please, Dr. Jyoti, please answer this.
Yes.
What should we?
Sir, actually, as she had already spoken, whether depending on what is the so-called infection, once we have prepared that wet film and we have ruled out, and also by the physical appearance, whether it is a candidiasis, we with the antifungal, and if it is bacterial vaginosis, then we give the met. So and also the pessaries plus the probiotics.
The question was adolescent recurrent vaginitis, basically.
Yeah, can I just add on something?
Yes.
Yeah, basically when you have adolescent recurrent vulvovaginitis, I think we need to talk to them about the partners. That is one.
Yes.
You know, whether the partner tracing is there, partner treatment is there. And secondly, we need to counsel them regarding using barrier contraceptive, because, you know, adolescents might have more partners and kind of have, you know, problems related to that as well.
Yes, we should assume that they are having sexual intercourse, because nowadays it is quite common. And but is there any difference between a normal vaginitis and a recurrent vaginitis? That was the question basically. Why some patients have recurrent vaginitis, and what should we find out, and how do we find out for that?
Sir, I think have to when it is recurrent, we also have to rule out the other STDs. We have to do this contact tracing,
yes,
diabetes, and then also maybe for nutrition or hygiene, and
yes.
Along with the
I think and about your this thing, probiotics also have some role in that, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
There was another question about is there any role of a syndromic approach when we do not have the facilities of wet smear or something? So there is a syndromic approach in which we just treat by symptoms. So do you advise that?
Yeah, actually, Kishore, if we look at our practice in government hospitals, at least we are doing a syndromic approach only.
Yes, that is what.
Yeah, so we kind of look at the cervix in case the cervix is inflamed and we think it is the cause for vaginal discharge. Then we give our combination of azithromycin and secnidazole and cefixime, right? That combination we give. And in case we feel it is vaginal infection, then we would give a combination of fluconazole, secnidazole 2 grams.
Yes.
So
there was a question about V-wash. V-wash, is it of any value?
Sir, it is in fashion, and for some, definitely the vaginal hygiene, and it does change the vaginal flow, but prolonged use is harmful and should not be advised. Okay. And definitely for few days, along with the antibiotics and the local pessaries, it may help.
Absolutely right. So now I'll take some questions on torch infections by Dr. Manju Puri. So, madam, although you have clarified each and everything, but still there are some questions. The one question was, you said that we have to have a seroconversion to know whether this infection, that this particular infection was there and now it has, so that we can treat. So it means you have to get the test done first. So it means you will get the test done and then again you will get the test done after 4 weeks, isn't it?
Yeah.
So how will you select which patient you will get the test done, sir?
Yeah. So Kishore, this actually, the seroconversion part would kind of depend upon patients get their torch done many times.
Madam, question is of the people. I'm not asking.
No, supposing, there are 2 ways it can go about. One is the patient has already got a, done previous year she was negative and now she's positive. One. But normally it is done as, especially in European countries where they look for toxoplasma. So what they do is that they take paired sera. So as the patient comes, they take the blood sample and they preserve the sera.
Okay.
Is it right? So subsequently, if they have any symptomatology coming, they take another sample and then they might do it on both the, sera together and find out whether there is any change, seroconversion or not.
Okay. Madam, Dr. Puri, you are working in a government hospital. So in which patients you order a torch?
I would in my practice order for torch only based on ultrasound findings,
Okay.
because we normally would not have patients who come to us with symptoms. So basically it is when there is FGR, we can't explain if there's oligohydramnios.
So it will depend on the ultrasound first,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
then you will order whether it is, and if it is less than 20 weeks or so that you can proceed.
No, even afterwards, because we want to understand for our next pregnancy as to, what was the cause for the fetal loss or fetal damage this time.
So if, ma'am, there is a history of any IUGR or IUFD in your last pregnancy, will you order it in this pregnancy?
No, I said
IUFD.
that these, I made it very clear that if a patient has got toxoplasma or rubella infection, okay, she becomes immune lifelong. So it cannot be a recurrent cause. It cannot be a recurrent cause. Let's understand that. And if CMV immune, then also the previous obstetrical history will not
Yes,
govern
absolutely.
as to what is to be done this time.
Yes, that has to be clarified for the PGs.
It can explain the index event, but it cannot, there cannot be any recurrent events associated with torch group of infections.
Okay. And when we order this, because in private, you will find that most of the practitioners are ordering torch in pregnancy, and they are also getting, so should we get the avidity test also?
No, not.
And we should order before, or we should order after the we get the results of the IgG or IgM?
No. I think if you want to just do a screening, then it is best done before the pregnancy or maybe at the first visit. And in case if you have any of the IgMs coming positive, only then you would need to do a avidity testing. So it will depend upon whatever reports come. It need not be ordered in the first go, never in the first go.
Never in the first go. So when there is a doubt that whether it is a recent or it is a old one, only we should order an avidity test.
Yes.
Actually, in NHS in England, they have stopped doing rubella for from 2016 onwards. Now it's because they assume that all are covered, though all are immune basically. So
they
I
have
think,
that system. They have that system of immunizing all young girls, no?
Yes. So that is, I think, important for India also. Okay.
No, but remember that whenever there's a vaccination,
Yes.
the antibody titer can be low. So it is worthwhile, doing a IgG testing. When she showed you the prevalence of rubella, it was not 100% in India. It is something
it is
70%, no?
Yes.
Yeah.
And it is in France, it is about 80-90%. Achha, let us, madam, you said about acyclovir treatment. You said acyclovir 3 times a day, but it is books, it is written 5 times a day. So
no, this is the latest recommendation I'm talking about.
Okay, so it is 3 times, it is not 5 times, which was there before.
And it is 400 milligram. Yeah.
It is 400 milligram.
Yeah. The older one was 5 times. You are right. It was 5 times.
Okay, because that is what we remember.
And the suppressive dose is also the same.
Okay.
And obviously there was a difference between suppressive and the acute management, but now it's the same.
Okay, ma'am. I think rubella, most of the questions have been taken. Achha, there was, if the patient comes with a severe IUGR or a moderate oligohydramnios at 30 to 34 weeks, should we advise torch test or not?
I said yes, in case there is no other cause. It's preeclampsia. Got FGR. So we know that, you have a cause for that. If it is unexplained, do a APLA testing and we would do a torch testing in those patients.
Okay.
Trying to understand that event, no?
There was a study, a Korean study about the neonates, and they found that torch was not of value in the neonates, in IUGR babies in Korea. I don't know about, these are not Indian studies. Okay, but still, I think we should find, if we want to know.
If the patient can afford, then of course, yes, because we always try to understand as to what is caused that, because it will help us in managing her next pregnancy.
Okay, and when we have to know that 4-fold rise is there or not in the for IgG, when we should repeat, after 2 weeks or after 4 weeks? You said 2 weeks.
You know, it depends upon how much time do you have to yourself.
Okay.
Supposing you are trying to find out whether the acute infection has happened at 18 weeks.
Okay.
Then
we have
you not wait for 4 weeks, no? Then she will
okay, okay,
period of
because I think still we have 20 weeks only. It is not 24 weeks still.
no, it is 20 weeks. So it will depend upon, the best is to do it after 4 weeks, but you after 2 weeks ensure twofold rise also.
Okay. And somebody has wanted to know if the CMV active infection is diagnosed after 20 weeks. Is there a role of antiviral therapy? There is no role of antiviral.
No, there is no role of antiviral
So
therapy.
we should.
Sadly so, but we do not have any intervention available.
So only the herpes have got and the toxoplasma.
Yes.
These are two
Yes.
conditions in which we treat. Isn't
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think recurrent vaginal infections, foreign body has to be ruled out. That I'll just find out if there is any other questions. Most of the questions have.
Question, sir, how much time is taken zero conversion
4
from
weeks.
negative to positive?
4 weeks, I think.
Yeah, it would take about 4 to 6 weeks, Jyoti.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
And then they have asked, what is the suppressive therapy in last trimester for HSV?
Yeah, that's again acyclovir for 400 milligram 3 times a day, starting from 36 weeks till such time the patient delivers.
Okay, ma'am.
And the other condition which I said was that if you want to give a vaginal delivery to the patient, then if a patient develops it any time in the last trimester, so after 28 weeks, the first episode. So some people like to continue them on acyclovir till the time of delivery.
Right. Thank you, ma'am. Any other questions that you can see, sir?
Abhi to I have no. I think most of the questions have been answered.
Yeah, Dr. Mitra is asking, CMV and herpes are DNA viruses known to cause primary reactivation, reinfection. Okay, she's just commented on that.
She's already.
And for rubella screening, do you suggest IgG titers or simple qualitative test?
So we do a IgG titer only.
Titers we करते हैं इसलिए तो.
IgG positive or negative, we don't even look at the titers. If IgG is positive, we consider them as, you know, rubella immune.
But one thing is there, whenever there is a torch infection or the torch report, and the person becomes very anxious, and we have to counsel them. That is very, very important.
So that's what I said, that there has to be a whole lot of responsibility in ordering for torch. Please order only if you actually it is indicated, because there is no recommendation on universal screening as of now. So if we order it, we have to then kind of, take the whole decision and counseling till the end, and it can create a lot of confusions.
So there was a question.
Early recurrent miscarriages, what is the role of torch? Which torch test she advise?
None.
None.
Yeah.
Already it hasn't.
With a recurrent first trimester miscarriage comes with a torch report. So that is what we have to, I think, emphasize. It does not carry any role in first trimester miscarriages. We should not order that test at all.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Worried when they see IgG positive, no, they all think they have got infection. So you have to counsel them and tell them that they are actually protected. They should feel happy about it.
Yes, absolutely. IgG. Can you see? I can't see any other questions.
Yeah. There, I think the only excellent is seen for Dr. Manju Puri.
Yes.
Thank you.
It was.
Many excellent comments for Dr. Manju Puri, ma'am. I'm not able to see questions. There are only comments, and I think she has made it all so very clear. And actually, some people want, ma'am, very crisp. If we can make 3-4 PPTs like that tabular form, what is what, and we can just put it on these mail, because we have all the mail IDs of these people. We will be giving certificates to them, e-certificates to whoever has registered. So
I've recently written a chapter on this. Maybe I can share that chapter in case you want. Yeah.
No, chapter is very big. वो सिर्फ 5-7 छोटी slide बता
दो. पकाया खाना चाहते हैं सर.
I will. You want
ये है तो ये करो, ये तो ये करना है.
Yeah. I will give. Yeah. I'll share it with you.
Sure.
We start opening it and we read the first page and then we close it.
All right. All right.
Very good. I have one suggestion that there is a GPCR on this torch infections by Foxy. I think that is also useful. If some you can open it and see. That is also very, it is a tabulated form. You can use that also. But if Dr. Manju can share, that will be the best.
I will do.
I would request Manju ma'am to concise her full slides into 10 important, very important message giving slides. And those can be just mailed to each and every participant that has joined with us today. So it would be wonderful, ma'am, if you could do a little bit of homework for
I do.
so that
No
it
issues.
is a ready-made take-home package for us.
Yeah.
She's a fantastic teacher. She will do it, I think.
No, I know her, sir. That is why we rope her in every time we have a difficult topic. We get her, and still we have 208 participants who have still logged in at 5:23 when we were supposed to finish at 5 o'clock. And we nearly 299 participants who were there, Dr. Manju ma'am, to listen to you. It is a fantastic clearance of all our doubts. I think it is great that you could take out time for us. And also Dr. Kishore for taking out time from your schedule. And it is always a pleasure to have you join in. You are also a great teacher as Dr. Manju, because you also have vivid experience seeing so many cases every day in a government setup.
Yes.
So in the end, I think, sir, should we, now there are no more questions, so we
Yes,
can.
I can't see more questions, at least.
I think
I'll just have a look in the last.
And I think we would thank Mr. Manoj and Mr. Rajput from Tablets India, who have made this webinar so very interactive and so very informative. And because of you, we could sort of interact on this wonderful topic and hear so much from such learned teachers and people. And also thank you, ICOG, thank you, Her Afghan and DGF for joining in and giving this such a brand to the webinar. Thank you, Manju ma'am. We'll again disturb you sometime in the near future. And,
all right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you, Dr. Jyoti and Dr. Manju and everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, doctors, on behalf of Tablets India. And ma'am, today more than 600 registration were there, and almost 300 plus people have attended this meeting.
Very good rate.
Okay, good.
Thank you, ma'am. With your permission, we'll end the meeting today.
Yeah.
Can I end the meeting now, ma'am?
Yes. Thank you so much. Yes.
Thank you, doctor.
Thank you.